He had lived alone for 8 years, speaking only to his horses and the wind. But when 10 Apache women appeared at his gate that stormy night, begging for shelter, Tobias Redmont would face the hardest choice of his life, because the men hunting them were already close enough to smell the smoke from his chimney. The rain hammered against the wooden shutters like bullets, each drop a reminder of why decent folks stayed indoors when nature turned violent. Tobias sat by his fireplace, mending a bridle that had seen better days when the knocking started. Not the polite tap of a neighbor. This was desperate, urgent, the sound of people who had nowhere else to go. He froze, leather still in his hands. Nobody came to his ranch, not anymore. Not since he'd made it clear that Tobias Redmont wanted nothing to do with the world beyond his fence line. The knocking came again, harder this time, accompanied by voices speaking in a language he recognized but hadn't heard in years. Apache. His blood turned cold. The last time he'd heard that tongue, his wife and daughter were still breathing. The last time strangers had come to his door in the night, he'd buried everything he loved in the morning. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle mounted above the mantel, muscle memory from nights when sleep came with one eye open. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the tone of the voices. Not war cries or demands, but something that sounded almost like pleading. Maybe it was the way the wind carried their words, broken and desperate. Or maybe it was the realization that warriors didn't usually announce themselves by knocking. He approached the heavy oak door, each step measured and careful. Through the thick wood he could hear them more clearly now. Women's voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. One voice rose above the others, speaking English with an accent that made each word sound like it had been carved from stone. Please, we know you are there. We need shelter, just for tonight. Tobias pressed his palm against the door, feeling the vibration of their voices through the wood. 8 years of solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed danger. Not from the women themselves, but from whatever had driven them to his door in the middle of a storm that could kill a man in minutes. He thought of Sarah, how she used to scold him for his suspicion of strangers, how she'd say that kindness was the only thing that separated them from the animals. But Sarah was dead, and kindness had died with her on a morning when he'd trusted the wrong people. The voice came again, closer to the door now, as if the speaker had pressed her face against the wood. They are coming. If you do not help us, we will die out here. And when they find our bodies at your gate, you will die too. Tobias's hand hovered over the iron bar that secured his door. In 8 years, he had never removed it for anyone. But something in that voice, a certainty that made his stomach drop, told him that tonight, everything was about to change. Because somewhere in the darkness beyond his ranch, riders were closing in. And once they arrived, there would be no going back to the life he'd built in the shadows. The iron bar felt heavier than it should have when Tobias finally lifted it from its brackets. 8 years of rust and fear seemed to fight against his decision. But the desperation in that woman's voice had cut through his defenses like a blade through paper. The door creaked open, revealing a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 10 Apache women stood huddled against his porch, their traditional dresses torn and muddied, some bearing wounds that painted dark stains against the wet fabric. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, clutching a bundle that moved slightly. A baby, barely breathing in the cold. The oldest had silver threading through her black hair and eyes that had seen too much death. But it was the woman who had spoken through the door that commanded his attention. She stood slightly apart from the others, her chin raised, despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Blood trickled from a cut above her left eye, and her dress was torn at the shoulder. But her gaze held his without flinching. "I am Ayana," she said, her English careful but clear. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for 3 days." Tobias opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Questions crowded his mind. Where they'd come from, why they were alone, what kind of men were chasing them. But the sight of the baby's pale lips stopped his words. Some things mattered more than answers. "Come in," he heard himself say, stepping back from the doorway. Quickly, they moved like shadows, filing past him into the warmth of his main room. Tobias had forgotten how small his home felt with other people in it. For 8 years it had been his fortress, his refuge from a world that had taken everything. Now it seemed to shrink around these women who brought with them the smell of rain and fear and something else, the metallic scent of blood that wasn't entirely their own. Ayana was the last to enter, and as she passed him she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The soldiers who hunt us, they are not far behind. Maybe an hour, maybe less. They will not stop until every one of us is dead. Tobias closed the door and slid the bar back into place, knowing it was probably useless now. His sanctuary had been breached, not by force but by choice, and there would be consequences. There always were. "Why?" he asked, turning to face Ayanna. "Why are they hunting you?" Her dark eyes found his, and in them he saw a familiar pain, the look of someone who had lost everything and lived to tell about it. "Because we ran instead of dying quietly. Because we chose to live when they expected us to accept death. Because some of us fought back when they burned our village and killed our men." The baby in the young woman's arms made a weak sound, and Ayanna's jaw tightened. "And because one of their officers will not see morning if we live to tell what he did to my youngest sister." Tobias felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known soldiers like that, men who wore uniforms but had forgotten what honor meant, men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who might speak of it later. "How many are coming?" he asked. 8, maybe 10, led by a captain named Morrison. He has been hunting Apache villages for months, claiming we are hostile. But his real enemy is anyone who might report what kind of man he truly is. Tobias moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters at the storm-lashed darkness beyond his fence. Nothing moved that he could see, but that meant little. Professional killers knew how to move unseen, especially when they thought their prey was trapped. He turned back to the women who were now clustered near his fireplace, some tending to wounds while others comforted the youngest among them. They looked like survivors. Not warriors, but he'd learned long ago that survival sometimes required a man to become something he'd never planned to be. "There's a cellar beneath the kitchen," he said to Ayanna. "Stone walls, hidden entrance. It might hold all of you, but it'll be cramped." She shook her head slowly. "If they search and find us, you die with us. If they find an empty house with signs that people were here, they might believe you were not involved. We will not make you an enemy of the United States Army." Tobias almost laughed. 8 years too late for that conversation. "Lady, I became their enemy the day I decided to live past what they did to my family. The only question now is whether we run, or whether we make them pay for coming here." Something flickered in Ayanna's eyes. Surprise, recognition, maybe even hope. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, and with it, the cover that had protected them this far, because in the distance, barely audible over the dying wind, came the sound of horses moving through mud and the low voices of men who thought they had their prey cornered. The sound of approaching horses cut through the storm like a death sentence. Tobias moved with the efficiency of a man who had survived by thinking 3 steps ahead, grabbing his rifle and a box of ammunition from the cabinet. But as he turned back to the women, he saw something that stopped him cold. Ayanna was no longer the desperate refugee who had begged at his door. She stood differently now, her posture straight and commanding, and in her hands was a knife that gleamed with more than just firelight. The other women had transformed too, some clutching weapons they'd hidden beneath their torn dresses, others positioning themselves with the practiced ease of people who had fought before. "You are not helpless," Tobias said, understanding flooding through him. "We never were," Ayanna replied, her voice carrying a hardness that matched the steel in her grip. "But sometimes it is better to let men think what they wish to think. Captain Morrison believes he is hunting frightened women who will cower and beg. He is about to learn otherwise." The youngest woman with the baby moved toward the back of the house without being told, and 2 others followed her. They knew what they were doing, had planned for this moment. Tobias realized he wasn't sheltering helpless refugees. He was harboring warriors who had been playing a longer game than he'd understood. "How many men have you killed?" he asked Ayanna directly. Her dark eyes met his without shame. Enough to know that Morrison's soldiers are not the first to underestimate Apache women. They will not be the last, but they may be the most surprised. Outside, the voices grew clearer, men calling to each other through the rain, coordinating their approach. Tobias could make out at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more. Professional soldiers, but operating in territory they didn't understand, hunting prey they had completely misjudged. "The cellar," Tobias said again, but Ayanna shook her head. "We run now, and they follow us forever. We hide, and they search until they find us. But if we end this here, tonight, the hunting stops." Tobias felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years, the cold clarity that came before violence, when survival stripped away everything except what needed to be done. These women hadn't come to his ranch by accident. They'd chosen this ground, this night, this storm. They'd brought their war to his doorstep because they knew exactly what kind of man he used to be. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Ayana's smile was sharp as her blade. Captain Morrison expects to find helpless women. Instead, he will find us. But when his men see a white rancher fighting alongside Apache, they will hesitate. That hesitation will cost them everything. A horse nickered close to the house and heavy boots splashed through the mud outside. Someone was moving around the building, checking for exits, planning their assault. In minutes, they would be inside, expecting to find cowering victims. Tobias checked his rifle, ensuring a round was chambered. Sarah's voice whispered in his memory, reminding him that kindness was what separated them from animals. But kindness, he was learning, sometimes wore the face of violence when it was the only thing standing between innocence and evil. "There is something else," Ayana said quietly. "When this is over, if we survive, you cannot stay here. Morrison's death will bring questions, investigations. They will come looking for answers." Tobias nodded. He'd known that the moment he'd opened his door, 8 years of peace was ending tonight. But maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Maybe some men weren't meant to hide from the world forever. Outside, a voice rang through the storm, commanding, arrogant, certain of victory. "I know you're in there. Come out now and we'll make this quick." Captain Morrison had arrived, and he was about to discover that some hunts end with the hunter becoming the prey. Tobias positioned himself at the front window, while Ayana and 3 other women spread throughout the main room, invisible in the shadows cast by the dying fire. The remaining women had melted into the back of the house, creating multiple lines of defense that would confuse any assault. These weren't desperate refugees. They were a coordinated war party that had been planning this confrontation for days. "Rancher," Morrison's voice boomed again. "We're tracking dangerous fugitives. Open this door or we'll assume you're harboring enemies of the United States." Through the shutters, Tobias could see shapes moving in the darkness. Soldiers spreading out around his house, taking positions that would prevent escape. Standard military tactics, but they were operating under false assumptions. They thought they were surrounding a cabin full of frightened women and maybe one sympathetic rancher. Ayana appeared beside him, moving so silently he didn't hear her approach. "The one by the barn," she whispered. "He is Sergeant Blake. He was there when they killed my husband. The one near your well. That is Corporal Hayes. He held my sister down while Morrison—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tobias felt something dark and familiar rise in his chest, the same cold rage that had sustained him through 8 years of isolation. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were predators in uniform, and predators understood only one language. "How do you want to do this?" he asked. "Morrison will come through the front door. He always does, wants to see the fear in his victims' eyes. His men will come through the back and sides, but they expect to find women too frightened to fight and a rancher too scared to resist." She handed him something, a small mirror, polished to shine. "When you see the signal, take Morrison. We will handle the rest." Tobias was about to ask what signal when a new voice cut through the storm. Young, uncertain, nothing like the harsh commands they'd been hearing. "Captain, sir, maybe we should just search the place and move on. Could be just some old rancher riding out the storm." Morrison's laugh was ugly. "Private Wilson, those tracks led right to this door. 10 women moving fast, bleeding in at least 3 places. They're in there, and so is anyone stupid enough to help them. We do this by the book. My book." Tobias heard the unmistakable sound of rifles being readied, safeties clicking off. Whatever was about to happen, it was happening now. If you were Tobias, what would you do? Open the door and try to negotiate with men who had already decided to kill everyone inside? Or trust these Apache women who had turned his sanctuary into a battlefield? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose. Because what Tobias decided next would determine whether justice or murder ruled this night. He made his choice. The front door exploded inward as Morrison kicked it open, his rifle raised and ready, but instead of finding cowering women, he found himself staring down the barrel of Tobias's Winchester. For a split second, confusion flickered across the captain's face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. That second of hesitation was all Ayana needed. The mirror flashed in the firelight, reflecting a signal to positions throughout the house. The storm that had hidden the soldiers' approach now muffled the sounds of what followed. The whisper of blades finding their targets. The muffled grunts of men who died before they could scream. The wet sounds of justice being served with Apache steel. Morrison's eyes widened as he understood he'd walked into a trap. But understanding came too late. Tobias's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Ayana appeared behind the captain like a shadow given form. "This is for my sister," she whispered in Morrison's ear. her blade sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. Morrison dropped his rifle, his hands clutching at the wound. But Ayanna wasn't finished. She wanted him to see her face, to know who had brought him justice. And this is for every woman you thought was too weak to fight back. But as Morrison fell, a new sound reached them through the storm. More horses, more voices. Morrison hadn't come alone after all. Somewhere in the darkness, reinforcements were approaching, and the real battle was just beginning. The sound of approaching reinforcements turned Tobias's blood to ice. Through the broken doorway, he could see torch flames dancing in the darkness, at least a dozen riders. Maybe more. Morrison had been the advance party, not the main force. The real army was just arriving. Ayanna pulled her blade free from Morrison's chest, her face grim as she processed what they were hearing. Around the house, her women appeared from the shadows like ghosts, each confirming what Tobias already knew. Morrison's original squad was dead, but their victory had lasted exactly 30 seconds. How many? Ayanna asked the woman who materialized beside her. 15 riders, maybe 20. They heard the gunshot. They know something went wrong. Tobias felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Fight and die, or surrender and die slower. But as he looked at these women who had turned his sanctuary into a battlefield, he realized there might be a third option, one that required him to become the man he used to be before grief had turned him into a hermit. The storm cellar, he said quickly. Not to hide, to survive what comes next. Ayanna shook her head. We cannot run from this many. They will hunt us across 3 territories. We're not running, Tobias replied, moving toward a cabinet he hadn't opened in 8 years. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were things he'd hoped never to touch again. Dynamite. Fuses. The tools of a man who'd once demolished mountainsides to build railroads. And later, other things when the war had required it. My ranch sits on a hill, he explained, his hands working automatically to prepare charges. Natural drainage runs down both sides. When the spring floods come, all that water has to go somewhere. Understanding dawned in Ayanna's eyes. The dam. Tobias nodded. I built it to control flooding, but take it out during a storm like this. He gestured toward the approaching torches. That valley fills with 10 feet of water in minutes. Anyone caught down there dies, Ayanna finished. But we would be destroying your home, your land. Tobias looked around the cabin that had been his prison for 8 years, then at Morrison's body cooling on his floor. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was a choice, and his choice was to make sure these women lived to see morning. Some things matter more than property, he said, echoing words Sarah used to speak when he'd gotten too attached to material things. Outside, the voices were getting closer, orders being shouted, positions being taken. Someone had found Morrison's body by now, seen the blood, understood that their easy targets had become something else entirely. The youngest woman appeared with the baby, who had somehow slept through the violence. But now the child was awake, dark eyes wide and alert, as if sensing the tension that filled the air. Lieutenant Morrison is dead, a voice bellowed from outside. Surrender now, or we burn you out. Ayanna looked at Tobias, her expression unreadable. If we do this, there is no going back. You will be a wanted man for the rest of your life. Tobias shouldered his rifle and picked up the prepared charges. Lady, I've been a dead man for 8 years. Tonight I'm choosing to live again. But as they prepared to leave through the back entrance, a new sound stopped them cold. The cry of a baby. Not the one in their arms, but another, somewhere out in the storm. One of the soldiers had brought a child with him. Because sometimes the worst monsters hide behind the most innocent shields. And the hardest choices are the ones that test how far a man will go to save the people who matter most. The cry of that distant baby changed everything. Tobias froze halfway to the back door, the dynamite suddenly feeling like lead in his hands. Through the broken front entrance, torchlight flickered across Morrison's body. And somewhere beyond that light, an innocent child was caught in the middle of a war that had nothing to do with them. Ayanna grabbed his arm, her grip iron strong. It could be a trick. Soldiers have used such things before. But Tobias shook his head. He'd heard too many real cries in his life to mistake the genuine terror in that small voice. Someone out there, probably one of Morrison's men, had brought their own child on what they'd expected to be a simple murder mission. Now that child was about to pay for their father's sins. We can't blow the dam, he said quietly. Not with a baby down there. Then we all die, one of the other women hissed. My daughter's life matters as much as that one. She was right. And Tobias knew it. But some lines once crossed changed a man forever. He'd been walking the edge of that line for 8 years, and tonight he either stepped back or fell off completely. "There's another way," he said, setting down the explosives. "Harder, more dangerous, but it keeps everyone breathing." Ayana's eyes narrowed. "Tell me." "We make them think we're trapped. Make them overconfident. They'll send men to flush us out while the rest stay back with the horses and—" He paused. "And whoever brought that baby. That leaves us outnumbered 3-1. In a fair fight? Yes. But this won't be fair." Tobias moved to another cabinet, this one containing items that spoke to a different kind of warfare. Caltrops, iron spikes designed to cripple horses. Trip wires that could break a man's neck in the dark. Bear traps that had never seen a bear but had tasted human flesh during the war. 8 years ago, I turned this place into a fortress because I was afraid of dying. Tonight, we're going to use those defenses to make sure other people live. Outside, the voices were organizing. Someone was taking command, probably Morrison's second. Orders were being given, positions assigned. They had numbers and training, but they were operating in the dark on ground Tobias knew like his own heartbeat. "How do we divide them?" Ayana asked. "We give them what they expect. A last stand. Barricade the front, make noise, make them think we're cornered and desperate. Half their force will come for us. The other half will stay back to secure the retreat route. And then," Tobias smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression, "then we show them the difference between hunting frightened women and fighting people who've got nothing left to lose." The plan was simple, brutal, and completely insane. Ayana and 4 women would create a distraction at the front of the house, making enough noise to draw the assault team. Meanwhile, Tobias and the remaining women would circle around through terrain only he knew, targeting the reserve force and, hopefully, getting that baby to safety. "If this goes wrong," Ayana said as they prepared to split up, "Morrison's death will mean nothing. They will paint us as savage murderers and use our bodies to justify 10 more raids. And if we do nothing," Tobias replied, "that baby out there dies for its father's crimes and you all die for the crime of wanting to live. Sometimes the only choice is between bad and worse. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." The baby's cry came again, weaker now, and Tobias felt time slipping away like water through his fingers. Every second they delayed was another second closer to a child's death, another moment that would haunt him if he survived this night. "Move," he whispered. As Ayana and her team took positions at the front of the house, Tobias led the others into the storm through his back door. The rain was lighter now, but the ground was treacherous, and one mistake would alert the soldiers to their flanking maneuver. But as they crept through the darkness toward the sound of horses and hushed voices, Tobias realized he'd made a critical error in judgment. The baby wasn't with the reserve force. It was much closer to the house, somewhere between the two groups, which meant saving the child would require walking directly into the crossfire. The baby's cries were coming from a wagon positioned between the house and the soldiers' main camp. As Tobias crept closer through the mud and darkness, he could make out the shape of a military supply cart, and beside it, a woman hunched over something small and moving. Not a soldier's wife. This woman wore the rough clothes of a camp follower, probably a laundress or cook who'd been forced to bring her child on what should have been a simple mission. Tobias signaled for the Apache women with him to hold position while he moved closer. Through the rain, he could hear the woman's desperate whispers as she tried to calm the crying infant. She was trapped between two forces about to collide, with nowhere to run and no way to protect her child from what was coming. From the house came the sound of Ayana's distraction. Gunshots, shouting, the crash of furniture being overturned. It was working. Through the darkness, Tobias could see soldiers moving toward the house, leaving the supply area lightly guarded. But lightly still meant 3 armed men who would shoot anything that moved. He made his decision. Rising from cover, Tobias walked directly toward the wagon. His rifle held low but ready. The nearest guard spotted him immediately, raising his weapon, but Tobias called out in a voice that carried calm authority. "Easy, soldier. Lieutenant Morrison sent me to secure the civilians." The lie bought him precious seconds. In the darkness and chaos, wearing his dark coat, he could pass for military at a distance. By the time the guard realized his mistake, Tobias was close enough that shouting would bring attention neither of them wanted. "You're not army," the soldier said, but his voice held uncertainty rather than alarm. "No," Tobias agreed, and struck the man across the temple with his rifle butt. The soldier dropped silently into the mud, The woman with the baby looked up as Tobias approached, terror bright in her eyes. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 19, with the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much hardship for her years. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt my baby. She's done nothing wrong." "Neither have you," Tobias said quietly. "What's your name?" "Mary. Mary Hendricks. I cook for the men, do their washing. Captain Morrison said it would be safe, said we were just going to arrest some women who'd stolen horses." Tobias felt anger burn in his chest. Morrison had lied to his own people, turned a cook and her baby into unwitting accessories to murder. Even dead, the man was still destroying lives. "Mary, I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" She nodded frantically, clutching her baby closer. "There's going to be more shooting in a minute. When it starts, you run toward that grove of trees and keep running until you can't hear the guns anymore. Follow the creek downstream. It leads to a trading post about 5 miles south. Tell them Tobias Redmont sent you." "What about you?" she asked. Before Tobias could answer, the remaining guards spotted him. One shouted a warning while the other raised his rifle. But the Apache women Tobias had left in position were already moving, emerging from the darkness like vengeful spirits. The fight was brief and decisive. These soldiers had expected to face frightened refugees, not experienced warriors who'd been planning their revenge for days. Within minutes, the supply area was secure, and Mary Hendricks was running into the night with her baby, disappearing into the safety of the storm. But their victory was short-lived. From the direction of the house came a new sound. Not gunfire, but something worse. Silence. Either Ayana's group had won completely, or they were all dead. And rising above the dying storm, a new voice called out with cold authority. "This is Colonel Bradley, United States Army. You are surrounded by a full company of soldiers. Surrender now, or we will burn you out and hang the survivors." Tobias felt his blood turn to ice. Morrison hadn't been the real leader after all. Somewhere in the darkness, a much more dangerous enemy had been watching, waiting, letting others do the dying while he positioned his forces for the killing blow. Colonel Bradley's voice carried the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Through the darkness, Tobias could see torches spreading out in a wide circle around his property. Not the dozen riders they'd originally faced, but what looked like a full military operation. Morrison had been the bait, and they'd all walked straight into the trap. But as Tobias processed this new threat, he heard something that changed everything. Ayana's voice calling from the direction of the house. "Tobias, we have Bradley's son." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting to see how this would unfold. Then Bradley's voice came again, but now it carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "Release the boy and we can discuss terms." "There are no terms," Ayana shouted back. "Only justice. Your men destroyed our village, murdered our families, and worse. Now you will answer for their crimes." Tobias made his way back toward the house, moving carefully through terrain that was now a maze of soldiers and positioned weapons. As he got closer, he could see the situation more clearly. Ayana's group had indeed won their fight, but at a cost. 2 of the Apache women lay still in the mud, their sacrifice buying the others a chance at survival. Inside the house, he found a scene that would have been impossible to imagine an hour earlier. Ayana stood behind a young man in lieutenant's uniform, her knife pressed to his throat. The boy, and he was barely more than a boy, had Bradley's eyes and the same aristocratic jaw. But where his father projected cold authority, the son showed only terror. "He came through the back," Ayana explained quietly. "Thought he was being clever, flanking us while his father's men attacked the front. Instead, he delivered himself to us." The young lieutenant tried to speak, but Ayana's blade pressed closer to his skin, drawing a thin line of blood. "How old are you?" Tobias asked the boy. 19, came the whispered reply. "Same age as the cook's daughter who just ran into the night because your father turned her into a target. Same age as some of the women your captain murdered." Tobias moved closer, studying the boy's face. "Tell me, Lieutenant Bradley, did you know what Morrison was really doing to those villages?" The young man's eyes flickered between Tobias and Ayana, understanding finally dawning. I thought we were suppressing hostile Indians. Father said they were raiders, that we were protecting settlers." "Your father lied," Ayana said softly. "We were living peacefully until Morrison came. We grew corn and raised children and bothered no one. But peaceful Indians don't justify military budgets." "Do they?" Outside, Bradley's voice came again, more desperate now. "I have 60 men surrounding this house. Release my son, and I'll give you safe passage to the territorial border." Tobias almost laughed. Safe passage from a man who'd built his career on broken promises and manufactured wars. But as he looked at the young lieutenant, he saw something that gave him pause, genuine shock and growing horror as the boy began to understand what he'd been part of. "There's another way," Tobias said to Ayanna, "one that doesn't require his death. He is guilty by association. His ignorance does not absolve him. No, but his testimony might convict his father." The idea crystallized as he spoke. A colonel's son, testifying about systematic murder disguised as military action. It would destroy Bradley's career and expose the corruption that had enabled men like Morrison. "You want me to betray my father?" the young lieutenant whispered. "I want you to tell the truth," Tobias replied. "The question is whether you're man enough to face what that truth means." Before anyone could respond, a new sound cut through the night, horses approaching at full gallop, and with them, voices shouting orders that didn't come from Bradley's men. Someone else was arriving, someone with enough authority to make a full colonel nervous. Through the broken door, Tobias could see new torches, these carried by riders wearing different uniforms. Federal marshals, maybe, or territorial investigators. Someone had been watching Bradley's operations, and tonight's massacre had finally drawn official attention. As understanding dawned, Tobias realized they might all survive this after all. But survival would come with a price. The truth would have to be told. Justice would have to be served, and powerful men would have to fall. Young Lieutenant Bradley looked between his captors and the approaching reinforcements, then at his own reflection in the blade still pressed to his throat. "What do you need me to say?" he whispered. "If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." Dawn broke over Tobias Redmont's ranch 6 hours later, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for a night that had ended one kind of war and started another. The federal investigators had listened to Lieutenant Bradley's testimony with growing horror, documenting crimes that reached far beyond Morrison's unit and implicated officials all the way to the territorial capital. Colonel Bradley was led away in chains, his military career destroyed by his own son's courage to speak truth. The surviving Apache women were granted federal protection and compensation for their losses, though no amount of money could restore their murdered families. Tobias stood in the doorway of his ruined home, watching Ayanna prepare to leave with her people. The baby they'd saved, both the Apache child and Mary Hendrix's daughter, had survived the night, though the cost in other lives had been terrible. "Where will you go?" he asked Ayanna. "North to relatives who escaped Bradley's campaign. We will rebuild, but not here. This place holds too much blood now." She paused, studying his face. "What about you? Your home is destroyed, your solitude ended. The man who lived alone for 8 years died tonight." Tobias nodded. She was right. The hermit who'd hidden from the world was gone, replaced by someone who'd remembered that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. "I think I'll head west," he said. "Find some place that needs a man who knows how to build things and isn't afraid to defend them." Ayanna smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "That cook, Mary Hendrix, she will need protection until she reaches her family in Denver. The trail is dangerous for a woman alone with a baby." Tobias understood. His first act as a man reborn wouldn't be running toward a new life, but ensuring others reached theirs safely. As the Apache women rode north toward hope, and Tobias prepared to ride west toward redemption, the sun climbed higher over a ranch that had seen too much death and just enough justice. Sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of another. And sometimes a man who thought he was finished with living discovered he was just getting started. Years later, travelers would tell stories of the night 10 Apache women, and one lonely rancher stood against an army and won. But those who lived it knew the truth was simpler and more complex. Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong, but between staying safe and staying human. And sometimes, when the choice matters most, being human is the only thing that really counts. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.